Welcome back, everybody, to the NCAA Next Up Dynasty here on NCAA Football 14 as we watch the stars of tomorrow competing in the 2023 college football season, and it's really coming down to it. We're about two-thirds of the way through the season, and it has been quite the year of college football so far. Last episode, we went through weeks 7, 8, and 9. A lot of big-time matchups in that episode, a lot of big-time upsets, and plenty of movement across the top of the polls. Today, we'll be going through weeks 10, 11, and 12 as we're really getting down to it, really figuring out which teams are going to be in the race for these conference championships, and thus the college football playoff, which, of course, has been moved to 12 teams for this upcoming season. So as we look at where we are currently with the polls, I think the big storyline, at least in the last episode, was the rise of the TCU Horned Frogs, who are one of just two undefeated teams left in the entire country, with the other one being Clemson. TCU is now ranked number 6, and they've got two big-time matchups today with Alabama and then Baylor. 4 of the top 7 teams play each other. Along with TCU and Bama, we've also got Georgia and Florida, and a bunch of other ranked games as well. So there's going to be plenty of fireworks here in Week 10, and then Weeks 11 and 12 as well. Should be a lot of fun. The Heisman race has been nothing short of wild, with no less than 30 different players in the running at some point this season. As it stands now, Houston quarterback Kane Sanders is the slight favorite to win the award. As we take a look at the slate of games today, a lot of big-time matchups in weeks 10 through 12. This upcoming week might be the most stacked slate of the group, with, of course, Georgia and Florida, and then Alabama and TCU being the most important games of the week. In Week 11, a lot of big-time matchups here as well. I'm really excited about the Florida State and Clemson game. Big opportunity for the Tigers to show that they are the best team in the country. And then Week 12, there's a big slate, particularly in the Big Ten and the SEC. So it should be a lot of fun. Strap in your seatbelts, get comfortable, because we've got a lot to go over. Starting with Week 10, Army and Air Force. Air Force has been dreadful this year. They were supposed to win the Pac-12, and they've been horrible. As for Army, their season started off really poorly with their starting quarterback last year, Amita Coney, suffering a season-ending broken foot in the team's first game of the year. They've turned it over to backup Justin Carter, also a senior, who did not have a lot of experience going into the season. He's been just fine, leading Army to a very respectable start. We'll see what they can do here against a very lackluster Air Force team, and sure enough, they would end up dominating in this game. It's been really impressive to see Army really rally around their backup quarterback, and what started off as a really bad season, they lost to an FCS opponent really early in the season, is now looking a lot better. As for Air Force, as I said earlier, they were supposed to do really well this year. They joined the Pac-12 and were immediately expected to be at the top of the conference, and they have been horrible. They're 2-7, they're 1-5 in conference, this game, of course, being out of conference. Number 12, Michigan heads down to the Coliseum to take on number 14, USC, in a Big Ten matchup. Michigan got embarrassed in the last episode by Ohio State and is looking to redeem themselves. They certainly looked like they were going to redeem themselves early in this game. Bartholomew Blount dominated out the gate, and Michigan really was in control going into the fourth quarter. It looked like this game was all but over, but USC did not quit. The Trojans stormed back in a major way in the fourth quarter. Their offense, which really had struggled early, finally started to get clicking. Scotty Kimbrell, USC's quarterback, really threw the ball well late in this matchup, including an absolute dime for junior wide receiver Hot Rod Pryor, which really put USC back in the game. They still had some damage control to do, but again, they are not going to quit. This is a run-first team who kind of had to adapt their offense here late in the game, and they certainly did that. Another touchdown here in the corner by Hot Rod Pryor. So it's a 3-point game. Michigan has the ball, looking to chew clock and end it, and Bartholomew Blount looks like he wants to get this game done with. Michigan survives despite a big comeback bid at the end of the game by USC. Both quarterbacks threw the ball at a really high level today. Michigan jumps up to 10, and with the 12-team playoff, it does look like as of now the Wolverines do control their own fate to get an at-large bid into the playoff. It's been a disappointing season for the Minnesota Golden Gophers. They had pretty big expectations and have kind of fallen on their face. They have beaten some really good teams this year, and they've got another one here coming to Minnesota, that being the number 11th ranked Oregon Ducks. The Oregon offense is so talented and so explosive, and they showed that off today in a major way. Running back Noel Hilaire and quarterback Barrett Cherokee ran loose today as the Ducks win 34-30. Minnesota kept it competitive the entire time, but they just could not stop the Oregon offense at all. Minnesota falls to 4-6. They've got to win out if they want to get a bowl. As for Oregon, they stay at number 11, now 7-2 here on the season with 3 more games to go. Got a big-time rivalry here. NC State facing off against the University of North Carolina. The Tar Heels have only lost 1 game. They look like a real sleeper for the college football playoff, but their rivals gave them everything they could bargain for, and this ended up being one of the most exciting games of the week. Freshman quarterback Jamarlin Griffin had a really solid day for North Carolina, rushing for a touchdown here. UNC would get the ball late, looking to answer as Graham Fisher would launch a dot into the hands of Obadiah Jackson for a game-tying touchdown, bringing us to overtime. NC State would start with the ball, and they would not disappoint as Griffin would connect with his wideout here for a touchdown. NC State leads by 7, and now North Carolina is going to need to make a big play here on a 4th down with the game on the line. Graham Fisher dances in the pocket, and he is sacked. NC State wins at 31-24. North Carolina loses their 2nd game of the season, a really, really big loss for the Tar Heels as they fall to 6-2. Good performance, good win for NC State. Missouri heads to West Virginia to face off against the Mountaineers. These are the top 2 teams in the Big 12 North Division. The South Division is a lot better with TCU, Houston, and Baylor, but somebody's got to win the North Division, and it's probably going to be one of these 2 teams. So winning this game would go a long way. And it was a rough start for Jose Alvaro and West Virginia. On the first play of the game, Jamison Anderson of Missouri, a possible first-round pick at corner, ended up getting a big pick 6. On the other side of the ball, senior quarterback Latavius Merrington had another good game, throwing a few touchdowns to his number 1 receiver, Tyler Maxwell. Latavius Merrington is a really talented player, and I could see him playing spoiler for a team like TCU in the Big 12 championship. West Virginia made a comeback bid late after a really slow start on offense, but it would be Missouri who gets the win. The Tigers control their own fate in terms of getting to the Big 12 championship as they win at 42-35. Jose Alvaro did not have his best day as his draft stock continues to slip a little bit, more so because a lot of the other quarterbacks have been so good. Number 4, Oklahoma heads to Mississippi State to take on the Bulldogs. 2 of the more fun teams to watch in the SEC, and this ended up being a really fun game. Both of these teams have really fun passing attacks with some really good receivers. Mississippi State quarterback DeAndre Smith did not have his best day. However, he was consistently bailed out by Romeo Gardner, the wide receiver, who had another big-time performance for the Bulldogs. This game ended up being a little bit too close for comfort, but the Sooners did avoid the upset bid. Romeo Colochi played quite well, particularly in the second half, guiding Oklahoma to the victory 26-20, particularly with this late rushing touchdown, propelling the Sooners to the win and the number 3 spot in the AP Top 25. Romeo Gardner, statistically, with another great game, 12 catches, 124 yards, and a touchdown. Normal day in the office for him. And then Romeo Colochi continuing to play really well. Started the season off kind of slowly, but he's definitely improved. Washington State is very quietly 6-1. They look like a real contender for the Pac-12. Got a tough out-of-conference game here against the Tulsa Golden Hurricane, who look like the best team in the Conference USA. Tulsa ultimately dominated this game, beating Washington State 48-20. This doesn't really affect anything for Washington State in terms of making the Pac-12 championship because it is an out-of-conference game, and thus Washington State remains undefeated in conference play. I think this game more so shows that Tulsa's really good. The best Group 5 team is automatically getting a bid into the college football playoff. So say a team like Middle Tennessee State kind of falls flat on their face at the end of the season, maybe Tulsa ends up grabbing that spot and makes a Cinderella run to the college football playoff. That'll be an interesting storyline to certainly watch out for. Number 18, Navy, coming off a huge win last week against Middle Tennessee State, heads to Notre Dame to take on the number 3 ranked Fighting Irish. This ended up being a pretty exciting game. These two teams usually play each other well. Notre Dame running back MJ Hill continuing his Heisman-esque season, running all over the Navy defense in this matchup. Notre Dame's a great run-first team, but so is Navy. And as good as MJ Hill played, and boy, he was damn good, Navy's rushing attack met the billing as well in this matchup. Navy freshman quarterback Chuck Burton has a lot of work to do as a passer, but as a runner, he's one of the best scrambling quarterbacks in the country. This late touchdown would propel Navy to the upset 31-24. That is back-to-back weeks where Navy has beaten a team ranked in the top 3. Last week it was number 2 Middle Tennessee State. This week it was number 3 Notre Dame. After that shocking upset, we'll now go to the 2 biggest games of the week, starting in Gainesville with Georgia and Florida. This was one of our 2 subscriber pick'em games of the week, with 79% of the votes going towards Georgia. I'm surprised it was that lopsided. This game ended up being pretty one-sided, but not in the sense of a blowout, but more so in the sense that both teams took turns dominating quarters. Florida led 20-0 after the first quarter, but once we got to quarter number 2, Georgia quickly responded. Senior running back Patalomayo Maluwalu is back after breaking his foot in the team's second game of the season, but that doesn't mean Keith Humphrey is going to lose his role. He performed so well after Maluwalu got injured. Georgia scored 14 in the second quarter and then 17 in the third to take a 31-20 lead going into the fourth. The Gators, who had not scored since the first quarter, knew they had to get back on track, and they would with a quick touchdown here by the quarterback Ernie Capillar, along with a 2-point conversion to cut the lead down to 3. Georgia would add a field goal and a touchdown to put themselves up 41-28 with about 5 minutes to go. The Gators know they have to respond quick, and that they would do with a nice touchdown by the senior running back Elijah Bryant, making it a 6-point game, giving Georgia the ball back with a couple minutes to go, trying to chew the clock and end the game. The drive started off well. Aaron Ketchikan, the quarterback, with a nice first down, but after a big sack on third down, Florida would get the ball back with one more opportunity to win the game down 6, but they would start inside the 10-yard line. The drive started off quickly with a really nice catch by the senior wide receiver Deontay Pickens to really set the foundation for the rest of the possession. A big Elijah Bryant run here would put them past midfield, and then with 30 seconds to go, Ernie Capillar would connect with the tight end Brandon Pickens in the end zone for a game-winning touchdown as Florida scrapes away from Georgia. They win it 42-41, and now the Gators are ranked number 4 in the AP poll. A huge statement win here for Florida. Georgia lost 2 games last season and still won the national championship, but Georgia's got a tough end of their season coming up as they still have to play against Kentucky and Auburn. With Patalomayo Maluwalu back healthy, I'm really curious to see how they're going to use him and Keith Humphrey, with how well Humphrey has done this year and how good Maluwalu was down the stretch last year. Our other game of the week is number 2 Alabama against number 6 TCU. Despite being 3.5-point underdogs, the undefeated Horned Frogs would end up getting around 75% of the vote. We know Alabama's a run-first team, and of course they ran it quite well, particularly senior Kyle McCloskey. However, the Horned Frogs proved to be legit, particularly on offense. Sterling Yorkshire, the senior quarterback, had a great game with a couple of nice touchdowns, including this one to the All-American tight end Mario Homeler. A beautiful throw here in the hands of slot receiver Cameron Lewis. And then a late rushing touchdown from sophomore running back Harry Stewart would put the game away as TCU ends up winning in somewhat dominant fashion, 41-24, as both teams swap spots in the AP poll. Alabama now number 6. TCU jumps all the way up to number 2. The Horned Frogs are clearly legit after beating one of the highest-ranked teams in the country in Alabama. TCU is a legitimate threat to go all the way and win the national title. And then our final game of Week 10. Number 10, Florida State heads down to Miami to take on the Hurricanes, who are ranked 21. It's been an up-and-down season for Miami. There have been some high moments and there have been some low moments. This entire game was one big low moment. Brody Kluge, the senior running back, was great per usual for the Seminoles, but the big story here has to be the performance of junior quarterback Jacob King, who had the best game of his college career, throwing for 4 touchdowns. Florida State's offense has been around Brody Kluge the past 2 seasons, but to see Jacob King throw the ball like this and see more of a multi-dimensional offense for the Seminoles suggests that they can hang with anybody in college football. Florida State moves up to number 8. They've got a huge matchup next week on the road against number 1 Clemson. A huge test for the Seminoles to see if they are legit or if they're a step behind Clemson. Also, shout out to Garrett Rodriguez, 7 catches, 223 yards. As for some of the other games, Duke drops 56 on Maryland. Their quarterback, Justin Tucker, has been on fire. We're going to talk more about him in just a moment. Arizona and Nebraska with nice wins along with Ohio State and Southern Miss. Arkansas squeaks away from New Mexico State in overtime. Baylor beats UCF 24-3. Penn State gets back on the win column. Rutgers beats Georgia Tech. Middle Tennessee State over USF. And then Clemson barely beats Wake Forest, only by 10. In some of the other games, Houston back on the win column. They beat Oklahoma State. LSU with a nice win over Michigan State, 31-28. Temple's keeping the good times rolling. They've won 3 in a row, now beating Western Kentucky. The Virginia Tech agenda is not looking too good. They lose to Boston College. Washington blows out Boise State. Big win for the Huskies. Oregon State blows out Utah. Tennessee still only has 1 win. They stink. Colorado upsets Cal. Wisconsin over UCLA. Stanford over Arizona State. South Alabama allows 51 points. I think the South Alabama Cinderella run is definitely over now. They are just a disaster. Vanderbilt back on the win column. Pitt back on the win column. Texas A&M beats Ole Miss, who is now 0-6 in conference. Syracuse back on the win column over Louisville, and that's about it. So as we look at the poll, obviously the big movement is TCU jumping up from 2 to 6. We had 2 of the top 3 teams lose this week, with Alabama and Notre Dame both falling to 6 and 9 respectively. Nice. Georgia also takes a big hit from 5 to 12, with a lot of teams moving up. Auburn is now ranked. They're coming off a bye week, but they just happen to move up. With Miami getting killed by FSU, they drop out. As for the Heisman watch, Kane Sanders still first, but a lot of movement otherwise. Sterling Yorkshire, Justin Tucker, Noel Hilaire, and MJ Hill currently the top 5. I want to talk about Justin Tucker real quick because he has been unbelievable the last 4 or so weeks. I mean, Duke is really good, and it's because of him. He has been truly dominant. Players of the week, linebacker Corey Clifford out of Pitt, and Akron quarterback Chris Morales. That'll bring us to the College Football Playoff Committee's rankings. They have TCU number 1 over Clemson. Very interesting. Mostly similar to what the AP poll is, minus just some small changes here and there, but nothing overly notable. Now that we're in week 11, we can see the award finalists for the first time as well. I'm going to do what I did last year and have you guys vote on all the major awards, but this is what they are looking like as of now. We'll scroll through all of the super big awards like the Maxwell, the Walter Camp, the big defensive ones as well. Interesting to see the players here. A lot of guys who were up here last year and a lot of guys who have really broken out onto the scene this year, which is, I think, what's really fun about college football. A lot of names we know and a lot of guys who really have performed well in their first real opportunities of playing time. Kane Sanders out of Houston being a good example. Nobody expected him to be this good this year, and, well, he's on pace to win the Heisman Trophy with how well he has thrown the football. Let's now talk about the Week 11 slate. We've got some big-time matchups in here. Of course, Florida State, Clemson at the back. Certainly the biggest one of the day. And then some other really exciting games as well. A lot of Big Ten stuff, a lot of Pac-12 matchups as well. Those conferences really coming down to it. So let's get started. We'll open up here in Pitt. Virginia Tech, a team I was high on and played really well early in the season. They've kind of fallen off a little bit against a Pittsburgh team who started the year off really rough. They're starting to play a little bit better. Virginia Tech has been led by their great passing game and the development of sophomore quarterback DeAndre Jones, who did not throw the football well today, but he did run it at a high level. The same can be said about Pittsburgh's young quarterback Warren Bishop. The story with him all season has been that he hasn't thrown it well, but he's been really good as a runner. Bishop was ultimately able to lead Pitt to the victory, 38-31. Both teams now 5-4. I might have jumped the gun a little bit on Virginia Tech to put them in the same tier as teams like Duke and Rutgers in the ACC because those two teams are clearly better than Virginia Tech. DeAndre Jones did not have a good performance, 11 of 28, but again, he was good on the ground, but slightly overshadowed by Bishop. The first snow game of the year is in Tennessee, of all places. 1-8 Tennessee against 1-7 Texas Tech. It's the toilet bowl in the snow. Tennessee's season has been an utter disaster. They've got to get something going here. Maybe against another bad team, they can. That's exactly what would happen. Tennessee finally with a good performance here Benjamin McKenzie throwing the football well. It's crazy that just over a year ago, Tennessee looked like a contender for the national championship, and now they're at the bottom of the SEC as the worst team in that conference. But a good win here today can hopefully get some momentum rolling in the program as they take this one 41-14. As for Texas Tech, they are equally as awful. They're now 1-8. They do have a good quarterback. Yahya Marshall, he's a sophomore. He's a good player. I'm surprised Texas Tech is this bad. But yeah, they're 1-8, and they get killed by an awful Tennessee team. They've got some NFL caliber receivers as well. Again, I have no clue how they're that bad. Number 14, Nebraska, facing off against a disappointing Minnesota team. While the Gophers have not lived up to expectations this year, Nebraska has exceeded all expectations, and the Cornhuskers have the real shot of making the Big Ten championship. Nebraska's an old-school team. They're not going to beat you with big plays. They're a hard-nosed football team who wins of a line of scrimmage. They can run the ball. They've got multiple good running backs. They've got a really reliable senior quarterback in Jeffrey McCoy as they win it 42-14. Minnesota now 4-7 will not be bowl eligible. What a disastrous season for the Gophers. Good win for Nebraska. They're now 8-1. They've got some big games coming up. This week, they're going to play Notre Dame. The following week, they play Oregon. So that'll really figure out if this Nebraska team is for real or if they're just not as good as those two schools. Notre Dame, Oregon, and Nebraska, keep in mind, are all in the Big Ten West. So that'll really determine who ends up making the Big Ten championship out of that side of the conference. Again, as for Minnesota, really disappointing season. They've had some good games, some big wins, such as the game against Notre Dame, but other than that, it's been mostly bad. Penn State started the year off red hot. They have really come back down to earth. We'll see what they can do here at Beaver Stadium against a struggling Northwestern team. This ended up being a lot closer than it should have been. It really seems like Penn State has kind of lost a step after their red hot start. Lyndon Kirkstead did play pretty well, had some really good throws, including that one to Shai Jones-Porter, but Northwestern's offense kept pace the entire game. This late touchdown by running back Koko Zovic would tie the game up at 31, bringing us to overtime. Northwestern would open up with the football. The senior, Kevon Dorn, looking to throw it here on third down under a lot of pressure, and he would be sacked. A big stop for the Penn State defense, and then Northwestern would end up missing the field goal short. So all Penn State's got to do is score and they'll win the game, and that's exactly what they would do as Kirkstead connects once again with Shai Jones-Porter for the game-winning touchdown. Penn State ends up getting the win 37-31. Not a convincing win at all, though, for Penn State. They've got a big test next week against Michigan. That'll be a very interesting game. I think if Penn State loses that one, their college football playoff chances are pretty much thrown down the toilet. Northwestern falls to 3-7, but a great performance from possible first-round wideout Bubu Drame. One of our games of the week is Michigan State and Michigan here in the Big House. The Wolverines are 11.5-point favorites. They have 87% of the vote. And, well, you guys ended up being correct. Michigan ended up winning the game. They did not cover the spread, though. They ultimately won by 7. Michigan State always plays their rivals tough. That's why this happened to be one of the games of the week. But Michigan was still able to get the job done. Bartholomew Blunt had some really good throws in this matchup. And as we just talked about with Penn State, this is Michigan's opponent next week. If Michigan loses to Penn State, their playoff chances are pretty much toast. So that's going to end up being a huge game. Now, if Michigan wins that game against Penn State, I have a hard time thinking they don't make the playoffs because after that, Michigan's final game is against UNLV. So the Wolverines do control their own fate, but they've got to win next week against Penn State. So really excited for that game, which of course will be later in today's episode. North Carolina, coming off an embarrassing loss to their rivals, is trying to right the ship here against a really struggling Virginia team. Virginia was really good last year, and this season they've been, well, really bad. Except for today. Their quarterback, George Eddy, had 4 touchdowns in this one, 3 of which came on the ground as Virginia steamrolled past North Carolina. Going into the episode, I thought the Tar Heels were a legit sleeper playoff team, but that's out the window. They've lost 2 consecutive games against 2 bad teams. This one they lost by 20 at home. So, unfortunately for UNC, their playoff chances look like they are just about toast. Another team out of the race in a very competitive ACC. Virginia's been arguably the worst team in the conference this year. A huge win for the Cavaliers. Texas and Texas A&M, 2 big-time rivals here in the SEC, facing off in a rainy afternoon here in College Station in Texas A&M. So the story of this game was Texas wide receiver Washington. He's a senior, projected to go in the first round of this year's draft, but his first round projection is more so because of his previous pedigree and not because of his play on the field this year. He really needed to have a big game this season to prove to scouts why he's a first rounder, and that he did today. 10 catches, 169, nice receiving yards, and 3 touchdowns to essentially carry Texas to a close win. That's not to discredit quarterback Onyx St. James, because he has drastically improved throughout the season for the Longhorns. Luca Franco, Texas A&M's quarterback, has also really improved. I've been impressed with his development. The Aggies just aren't really winning games. Onyx St. James throwing for 4 touchdowns in this one, one-upping Luca Franco. But again, the big performance was Washington, cementing himself as a first-rounder and possibly a top 10 to 15 pick. Arizona heads to a snowy Corvallis to take on Oregon State. The Beavers are not bad at all. They're not in that top tier of Pac-12 teams like Arizona, Washington, and Washington State. But Oregon State's a tough out. Arizona's really good too. Their quarterback, Kareem Kamara, is a special talent, and boy did he look special today. The Wildcats look like they could be a legit threat to win the Pac-12, make the college football playoff, and who knows from there. Kamara is just so talented. The Wildcats win it 35-21. They are now ranked number 17 on the season with a record of 8-1. Oregon State falls to 5-4. Again, not a bad team by any stretch, but Arizona's just really good. Kareem Kamara is a joy to watch. The Pac-12 race is really interesting. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in just a second. It's snowing in Kentucky as well. I feel like it's snowing everywhere. They're facing off against their rivals, Louisville. Louisville has not been playing great football as of recent, but again, in rivalry matchups, teams usually play closer to how good they are. And again, that was the case today. Louisville showed up against a really good Kentucky team fighting for the college football playoff, but unfortunately for Louisville, they just didn't quite have enough juice as Kentucky was able to win the game 35-28. Senior quarterback Isaiah Gordon continues to rise his draft stock as a possible future first-round pick. Kentucky has not lost any in-conference games this year, so although Georgia and Florida might be ranked a little bit higher, the Wildcats are currently penciled in to make the SEC championship. They do have some tough games the rest of the way, so it's no guarantee, but good win over their rivals, even though the game was a little bit closer than it should have been, especially considering Louisville's lost, I think, 5 in a row. Louisville started the season off pretty well, but they've reverted back to being pretty bad, just like they were last year. So Kentucky at 7-0 is currently above Florida and Georgia. They've already beaten Florida, and they play against Georgia in Week 13. That'll be a big matchup in the next episode. Next up, we've got another one of our games of the week, Duke and Rutgers. The vote ended up being a 50-50 split. So we talked about Justin Tucker, Duke's quarterback, a little bit last week. Really curious to see what he can do in a big game today, if he can pass the test. And, well, he passed with flying colors. Justin Tucker had a great performance here against the Rutgers Scarlet Knights. Rutgers doesn't have a great defense, but still, against a ranked opponent on the road, it was really good to see Tucker play well, while Rutgers defensive players are, teleporting through the field. I don't know how that's possible, but okay. Ultimately, Tucker was able to lead Duke to the win. Duke is probably going to win their division. They'll most likely play against either Clemson or Florida State in the ACC Championship. So if Duke can win the ACC Championship, they'll be in the college football playoff. Dr. Antoine played well for Rutgers, but ultimately not able to get the win. Still, I feel like Rutgers needs to be pleased with how this season has gone. They're 7-3. They're really playing well in the ACC. They've been ranked all year, but Justin Tucker's a little bit too good. Washington State coming off a tough loss last week against Tulsa, trying to right their wrongs this week against Boise State. The Cougars have not lost an in-conference game yet, well, until today. Boise State ran the ball phenomenally against the Cougars. Running back Zachary Lowe and sophomore quarterback Skipper Lansdale both had big performances for the Broncos as they were able to get the win over Washington State by the final score of 28-16. Boise State's been pretty solid in their first year in the Pac-12. Not great, but they've done a lot better than Air Force, put it that way. So Washington State loses their first in-conference game of the year, and now this Pac-12 race is really getting interesting. So the conference has three really good teams: Arizona, Washington, and Washington State. Clearly head and shoulders above the other teams. The twist is that they're all in the same division. Only one of them can make the conference championship, and they'll play against either Stanford or Cal. The other twist is that these three teams have not played each other yet. In Week 12, Arizona plays Washington. In Week 13, Arizona plays Washington State. And then in Week 14, Washington plays Washington State. So they all play against each other the final few weeks of the season. So we'll see who wins the North and makes it to the conference championship. Houston and Baylor is a very interesting matchup because these are two very different teams. Baylor 5th in rushing yards per game. Houston 1st in passing yards per game, led by the Heisman frontrunner quarterback, Kane Sanders. He's got to face off against a really good defense today. Baylor has the best defense in the Big 12, right up there with TCU, and one of the best defenses in college football. Sanders was a little bit disappointing today, but he was still good. I think the bigger disappointment was wide receiver Kramer Gilliford, who only had 40 yards, his season low. But Houston was still able to play to their strengths, which is obviously the passing game. Baylor was able to play to their strengths, the run game, with a big performance from freshman Dontavius Brown. So it really came down to which offense was able to adapt and which offense would ultimately be more multi-dimensional, and the answer ended up being Houston. They ran the ball pretty well today. Jax Alcock, the running back, had a big touchdown late to propel Houston to the victory, 35-34. Houston is now 8-2. They're back in the top 25. Baylor's still ranked, still ahead of Houston. Baylor did not throw the ball poorly, but they didn't have any big plays in the passing game for the most part. And then on the other side, again, Kane Sanders, a little bit disappointing for his standards, along with Kramer Gilliford, who only had 5 catches for 40 yards, but still a good win here for Houston as they are back ranked. And the final game of the day for Week 11, Clemson and Florida State. The Tigers have 71% of the pick'em vote, so Florida State has some people who believe in them, and those people would be very wrong. It was pretty obvious to tell early on that these were two totally different teams, and Clemson completely clobbered Florida State. Kobe Henderson, the running back, looked phenomenal. This does not look like a guy who tore his Achilles 13 months ago. He played great. Of course, their quarterback, Cade Hutchinson, is the projected number 1 pick. Hutchinson did not have his best day. He only went 12 of 22. He did miss some throws, but he also had some big throws, and the Tigers absolutely dominated, showing why they are the number 1 ranked team in the country. And right now, Clemson looks like the favorite to win it all as they end up winning 41-10. A dominant victory here for Clemson. And again, Cade Hutchinson did not play as well as he normally does. But I think this just shows how good the rest of Clemson's team is. And when Cade Hutchinson is on, I don't know if anybody can beat these guys. They look scary. As for Florida State, they can still get an at-large bid in the college football playoff. But they've got 2 tough games upcoming. They play against Boston College in Week 12, and then in Week 14, they go to Gainesville to face off against Florida, who is currently ranked in the top 5. As for Clemson, they've got their playoff spot almost locked up. They have 3 more games against 3 really good teams: Syracuse, Boston College, and South Carolina. I think as long as Clemson doesn't lose out, they'll probably, at worst, get an at-large spot. Obviously, they still want to play well. They still want to win the ACC championship, and they still want to get the number 1 seed in the college football playoff. But Syracuse only has 1 in-conference loss. So if Syracuse beats Clemson in Week 12, then Syracuse would take the lead in the division. Taking a look at some of the other Week 11 games, Middle Tennessee State beats ECU handedly. Notre Dame back on the win column. They beat UCLA. Ohio State steamrolls Purdue. Alabama wins a somewhat close game against Stanford. Missouri barely able to beat their rivals Kansas 38-31. Southern Miss squeaks away from Old Dominion in overtime. USC handles UMass. Florida handles Vanderbilt. Navy handles UConn. And then sort of some of the non-ranked games. UCF back on the win column. They beat Oklahoma State in a close one. Going down the board, nice win for Cincinnati. We haven't really talked about them a whole lot this series, I feel like. Ole Miss finally wins a conference game. They beat Arkansas. Colorado loses to Fresno State. Washington beats Utah, 5-1 in conference. The same record as both Arizona and Washington State. We already talked about them earlier. And then another big storyline, South Alabama. They are now 3-6. And the defending runners-up, they've got to win out if they want to make a bowl game. And next week, South Alabama plays against top 10 Middle Tennessee State. So things are not looking good for the Jaguars as we look at the top 25 polls. Really not a lot of movement other than Florida State dropping a little bit. No changes in the top 7. And then everybody from 14 to 8 move up a spot. Other than that, there is some movement here towards the back. Houston is now ranked along with Missouri, with Arkansas and North Carolina dropping out. The Heisman watch continues to be crazy, with Kane Sanders still in first, but a lot of guys right on his tail, with Justin Tucker, MJ Hill, Anthony Raymond, and Cade Hutchinson charging after him. Players of the week, we've got on defense, Troy Danham from Cal, 2 sacks, 2 interceptions, and then Scooty Young Jr., the quarterback out of Miami, with 6 touchdowns against a struggling Georgia Tech team who is now eliminated from bowl contention. As for the College Football Playoff Committee's rankings, they bring Clemson back up to number 1 over TCU, and other than that, again, pretty similar to the AP poll, minus a few small changes here and there. So let's get to Week 12, the final week of the day. There are a lot of big-time matchups here in all of these big conference races. We're going to go over more games than normal here for Week 12 because at this point in the season, a lot of these games are so important. The difference between the 14 playoff and the 12-team playoff is all of these conference races are so important. If the 14 playoff was still here, we wouldn't be talking about, say, the Pac-12, for example, but every Power 5 winner makes it into the college football playoff this year, so the Pac-12 is more important than ever. So let's get started here with a non-Power 5 game. Middle Tennessee State ranked number 7, facing off against South Alabama. These two teams were the darlings of college football last year. They both made it to the 4-team college football playoff. Middle Tennessee State losing in the semifinals to Georgia. South Alabama losing in the national championship to Georgia. Middle Tennessee State's a lot better than South Alabama, and they showed it early here, the pick 6 by Justin Kaplan. South Alabama made it a competitive game. They only lost by 7. But Middle Tennessee State was still able to get the win pretty handedly. Nehemiah Dalton with a big game, the senior wide receiver. Middle Tennessee State controls their own fate. If they win out, they are going to probably be the Group 5 auto bid in the college football playoff. Drain Ignatius did not have his best day, throwing 3 interceptions, but it didn't matter as Middle Tennessee State was still able to get the job done. So as we look at their schedule, they've got some good wins in there. Obviously, the Navy loss is unfortunate. But they have Rice, they have UConn. UConn's pretty tough. And then assuming they make the conference championship, which if they win out, they will, they'll probably face off against an interesting Tulane team who has won 5 of 6. Number 5, Ohio State heads to Indiana to take on the Hoosiers. Indiana's a tough opponent. And, well, obviously Ohio State's the favorite, but Indiana could be a team who upsets them. Or not. The Buckeyes completely steamrolled past Indiana, and with this win, Ohio State has clinched the Big Ten East, so they will be going to the Big Ten Championship. Ohio State only has 1 in-conference loss. Michigan and Penn State both had 2 going into the week. So now it is official. Ohio State will be going to the conference championship. Even if they lose in the conference championship, Ohio State, I think, has positioned themselves well enough to get an auto bid in college football playoff. Marco Brunley, the quarterback, with arguably the best game of his career. He was phenomenal. Number 1, Clemson, coming off a huge win last week against Florida State, heads to the Carrier Dome to take on Syracuse. This is a big game. If Clemson loses, Syracuse will take first place in the division. Well, Clemson took that idea personally and proceeded to dominate another opponent, winning this game 59-28. Kobe Henderson and Cade Hutchinson both were phenomenal, and Clemson continues to impose their will on everybody. That's back-to-back dominant blowout wins against 2 of the better teams in the conference. Clemson looks like far and away the best team in college football right now. I don't know if anybody can beat these guys, quite frankly. The Tigers have 2 more tough games, and then they'll have the ACC championship against probably Duke. But as long as Clemson does not completely piss the bed, they're going to the college football playoff one way or another. And if they win out, they will be the number 1 overall seed. They'll get a first-round bye, and they'll play the lowest-seeded team to win in the first round. So a great win here for Clemson. They continue to be so good. As for Syracuse, can't fault them. They're a good team. They're just not as good as Clemson. Florida State knows they got to get back on the win column. They got embarrassed last week by Clemson. They've got to right their wrongs here against Boston College, and that they would do. Florida State would end up winning this one 59-28, the exact same score that Clemson beat Syracuse. Brody Kluge played very well, per usual, and so Florida State is now 9-2. One more game in Week 14 against Florida, and that's going to be a really big matchup. Both Florida and Florida State are probably not going to play in their conference championships, but I think both teams are good enough to get an at-large bid into the playoffs. So that's a rivalry game with major playoff implications for both sides. That's going to be such a big-time game in the next episode between two arch enemies. Next up, we've got one of our games of the week. Nebraska heads to South Bend to take on Notre Dame. The Irish seem to be the heavy favorite amongst the subscribers. Maybe it's because a lot of people aren't necessarily familiar with Nebraska's old school, rough and tumble style of play. We'll get used to it because Nebraska's going to be playing some big-time games in January. The Huskers were able to come here into South Bend and upset the Notre Dame Fighting Irish 35-25. Again, this team runs the ball. They're tough. They're gritty. And as it stands now, not Oregon, not Notre Dame, Nebraska is projected to win the Big Ten West. Now, Nebraska still has to beat Oregon this upcoming week, and I think the Ducks are a little bit better than Nebraska, to be quite frank. But Nebraska controls their own fate at this point, and even if they do lose to Oregon, they could still get an at-large bid into the college football playoff. So if Nebraska loses to Oregon, then all hell's kind of going to break loose because all three of Nebraska, Notre Dame, and Oregon will have 2 in-conference losses. So we'll see what happens next week. We talked about how important this game is a little bit ago. Washington with 1 in-conference loss facing off against Arizona with 1 in-conference loss. This game is equally important for both sides. Should have told that to Arizona because the game did not look as important to them as it did to the Washington Huskies. Senior quarterback Keontae Jordan had a big performance here for Washington as they were able to get the win in this matchup 42-24. So if Washington beats Washington State in the Apple Cup in 2 weeks, the Washington will probably not just go to the Pac-12 championship, but they're going to be the favorite against either Stanford or Cal. Still a lot of football left to be played in the Pac-12. Arizona faces off against Washington State next week. That's a really big game. If Washington State wins that, then the Apple Cup in Week 14 will determine who wins the division. And if Arizona State wins that game, then again, I think all hell will break loose. Number 4, Florida heads to South Carolina to face off against the Gamecocks. Florida controls their own fate. Although they're not going to play in the SEC Championship, if they win out, they are going to get one of the highest at-large seedings in the college football playoff. The game was pretty competitive, but the Gators were ultimately able to prevail. Senior wide receiver Louis Diamatildis caught 3 touchdowns in this one, leading Florida to the win 38-26. So the Gators are now 9-2, and they play against Florida State in 2 weeks. We talked about how big that matchup is just a moment ago when we covered Florida State's game. So with both Florida and Florida State at 9-2, the winner probably goes into the playoffs with an at-large bid, and the loser, well, maybe not. I think Florida can still lose that game and get in as long as it's a competitive loss, but if Florida gets blown out by Florida State, then it's over. So they've got to win that game. They've got to control their own fate and put themselves into the playoffs. This snowy matchup might be the most important game of the day. Both of these teams have 2 losses. If they lose, they're probably out. If they win, they're probably going to get an at-large bid into the college football playoff. So it's pretty simple. Win and you're probably in. Lose and you're probably out. I was expecting an instant classic, close game. Not the case at all. Michigan completely steamrolled Penn State 40-13. Penn State's 5-0 start clearly looks like a mirage as they have completely fallen down to earth. As for Michigan, they're in a really good spot right now. They do not have to worry about the conference championship since Ohio State has already clinched the division. Michigan has 1 more game left this season. It's not against anybody in the conference. It's against UNLV. So if all they got to do is beat UNLV at home in Week 14, and they'll probably get into the playoffs as an at-large bid. So it looks like Michigan will be back in the playoff for a 2nd straight season. We've got UMass and Duke. Now, why exactly would I choose to cover this game? Normally, if I cover a game like this, it's because there was a big upset. UMass sucks. They're not beating Duke. The story of this game was quarterback Justin Tucker because this kid is unbelievable. Over 300 passing yards, over 200 rushing yards, along with 5 all-purpose touchdowns. Justin Tucker is an animal. And on this play right here, running for his 3rd touchdown of the game, he would strike the Heisman pose. Is that his Heisman moment? I mean, I feel like you can't have your Heisman moment against a 1-win team, but for Christ's sakes, the guy had 550 all-purpose yards and 5 touchdowns. I don't give a damn that it's against UMass. That's still unbelievably impressive. Duke is now 8-2. They pretty much clinched their division last week. They'll probably play against Clemson for the ACC championship. We've got another one of our games of the week. Baylor and TCU. The Horned Frogs would end up getting 93% of the vote to win this game. Sometimes it's good to pick upsets, and sometimes it's good to be logical and pick the significantly better team. That was the case here today. TCU would handle business once again. The story here was wide receiver Cameron Lewis, who caught 21 passes for 252 yards and 4 touchdowns. Sterling Yorkshire, the quarterback, completed 22 passes. 21 were caught by Cam Lewis. That's wild. TCU wins 40-21. They will remain at number 2. So the Horned Frogs are clearly legit. They had 2 games today against 2 ranked opponents in Alabama and Baylor, and TCU beat both of them by 3 scores. That says a lot. TCU clinches their division. They'll go to the Big 12 championship against probably Missouri. Number 11, Georgia lost their previous game against Florida, trying to get back on the win column here against Auburn. Georgia's in a sticky situation. If they lose, they are in trouble. Let's just say they are in trouble. Auburn's offense dominated in this one. Sidney McDonald, the quarterback, played great, throwing for 4 touchdowns, 2 of which were caught by wide receiver Trayon Scott, as Auburn wins it 52-35. And the defending national champions might be on the outside looking in for the college football playoff. Georgia's in a rough spot because they still have to play against Kentucky. If Georgia loses next week against the Wildcats, they're done. There's no way the College Football Playoff Committee can put a team in with 4 losses, especially 3 of them this late into the season. So Georgia has to beat Kentucky, and if they do, they probably get in. But if they lose, they're done. Number 21, USC, facing off against Stanford. Non-conference game, so it does not affect Stanford's positioning in the Pac-12 championship. But still an important game to see what they can do nonetheless against a rival. Stanford kept the game competitive, but USC was able to hold on to business. They won 42-32. USC and then Auburn, who we just talked about earlier, are in very similar positions because both teams have 4 losses, and you're probably not going to make the playoffs with 4 losses, but USC and Auburn have not had a bad loss this season. So if all hell breaks loose for the final couple weeks of the season, maybe a team like USC or Auburn with 4 losses can slip into the college football playoff. It's not likely, but I don't think it's entirely impossible. As for Stanford, they're now 5-5, 5-3 in conference, still projected to win the Pac-12 North, but they're going to have to beat Cal next week in order to do so. That's going to be a really, really big game. I'm excited about that one. Texas A&M heads down to Norman, Oklahoma to face off against the number 3 ranked Sooners. Oklahoma's got a pretty tough schedule the rest of the way, but they win out. They should be able to get an auto bid with 2 losses. This game ended up being awesome. Really, really fun matchup. Romeo Colucci, the Oklahoma quarterback, had the best game of his career. He was flawless throwing the football. And then wide receiver Bryce Berry III continued to show why he was the top projected receiver in the draft. Berry caught 3 touchdown passes in the first half. Oklahoma's offense was great. As good as their offense was, Texas A&M's was equally as good. Junior quarterback Luca Franco had the best game of his career, also throwing for 5 touchdowns, 3 of which were caught by the speedy sophomore Quinn Crew. This late touchdown by Crew would put A&M up by 5 with a couple minutes left to go. We'll see if Oklahoma can drive down the field, look to take the lead. Colucci rolling out to his right, throws up a prayer, get it to number 11, and get out the way. Bryce Berry with his 4th touchdown of the game to put the Sooners up by 2. A&M has one more shot. It's a 3rd down, and Franco would be sacked by Gilbert Smith, the possible first-rounder. 4th and long, 10 seconds to go. Franco has to heave up a prayer for the end zone, and it is caught for a touchdown by the tight end Josh Cook. A&M pulls off the upset, 47-42. What a game. Romeo Colucci and Luca Franco both played out of their minds. Oklahoma's in a really interesting spot because they still have 3 games to go. If they don't win out, they're probably in trouble. Oklahoma plays against Alabama still. If they win that, they probably go to the SEC championship. They're going to have to play against Kentucky, presumably. Odds are not in Oklahoma's favor right now. Number 6, Alabama returns to Tuscaloosa to face off against Mississippi State in the final game of the day. Mississippi State's really, really good. I think they should be ranked. I think they're one of the 25 best teams in the country.
I don't know why they're not unranked, even though they're only 5-4. They're really, really good. Their pass game, as we all know, is phenomenal. DeAndre Smith and Romeo Gardner both look more and more like first-round picks, and that was cemented again here today. Alabama, on the flip side, we know very good at running the football. Kyle McCloskey played really well again today. He's continuing to rise his draft stock. But Alabama's kryptonite is throwing the football. Troy Davenport, their quarterback, did not play well, and this late pick six would propel Mississippi State to the upset. Now, Alabama will be getting their senior quarterback back, Bryson Byrne, hopefully within the next few weeks. But Alabama's got a huge game this week against Oklahoma. They also play against Auburn. So if Alabama, who now has 3 losses, if they don't win out, they're probably not going to make the playoff. And they still have to play Oklahoma. They still have to play Auburn. And if they win those games, they'll still have to play probably Kentucky. So just like Oklahoma, things are not looking up in Alabama's favor. The Crimson Tide were ranked number 2 going into the episode. And now they take a number 2 as they lose 2 games and don't look like they're going to make the playoffs unless they can beat Oklahoma. Looking at some of the other scores, Kentucky rolls over Vanderbilt 45-14. Oregon drops 62 on Wisconsin. Wow, a lot of points. Missouri beats BYU by 1, essentially clinching the Big 12 North for the Tigers. Then going down the board a little bit here, Navy with another win. They are red hot. And then Southern Miss, they keep winning. They beat UL Monroe. Rutgers beats North Carolina in a shootout. The Tar Heels go 0-3 in today's episode. I don't think that's very good. Looking at some of the other scores, Army wins again. They beat Cincinnati. LSU wins again. They beat Old Dominion. Central Michigan, they are 9-1, very quietly dominating the MAC Conference. Kansas State beats Kansas. UCLA and Iowa both finished their seasons with under 500 records. Purdue gets better of Illinois. Air Force finally wins an in-conference game, although it's against Colorado, who is not much better. Michigan State beats Northwestern. Pitts beats Georgia Tech, who's now 2-8. Washington State beats Oregon State. So Washington State and Washington both have 1 in-conference loss. They're both a game ahead of Arizona. And then moving down the board even further, Maryland beats NC State by 1. Very close and exciting game there. West Virginia with a solid win over Iowa State. And that's about it. Let's take a look at our top 25 polls here going into Week 13. Just 3 more games to go here. Most teams only have 1 or 2 games left. Still got Clemson and TCU at the top. Both teams have around pretty much split first place votes. Clemson is 32, TCU of 29. Florida, Ohio State, Middle Tennessee State rounds out the top 5. We saw some big-time risers today. Nebraska for sure. Navy's now number 11. Look out for the midshipmen. And we see some big-time fallers. Notre Dame lost 2 games today. Alabama, Georgia, they all lost multiple games in this episode. Justin Tucker, after his historic performance against UMass, is now in first place for the Heisman. Sanders drops to 2 with Kate Hutchinson, Margot Burnley, and Dior Antoine in the top 5. Thad Murray of Temple wins his second Player of the Week, and then Justin Tucker obviously wins it on offense. As for the college football playoff rankings, again, nothing overly major. Clemson number 1, TCU number 2. The top 10 is pretty much the same, minus the fact that the committee really likes Navy. The midshipmen are ranked 9th. Could Navy get an at-large bid into the college football playoff despite having 2 losses and being a Group 5 team? Navy does have 2 signature wins against Notre Dame and Middle Tennessee State, so it is certainly possible. Let's run down all of the races throughout these conferences before we wrap up the episode. Starting the ACC, pretty straightforward. Clemson and Duke are going to play for the conference championship. Winner gets into the playoff. Clemson probably gets in no matter what. I think Florida State's the only other team who has a real shot at an at-large bid. Maybe Rutgers, but I find that unlikely. Florida State's probably got to win out against Syracuse and number 3 Florida. That's going to be pretty hard. So realistically, the ACC might only get 1 team. As for the Big 12, again, pretty straightforward. We're probably going to have Missouri and TCU in the conference championship. Maybe Houston gets an at-large bid. They're 8-2. They have a signature marketable player in Kane Sanders, so it's certainly possible if they win their final 2 games. The Big 10 is where things get crazy. So Ohio State has clinched the division because they hit the head-to-head tiebreaker over Michigan. Michigan's probably going to get an at-large spot. And then in the Big 10 West, a lot of craziness. Nebraska's a game ahead of Notre Dame and Oregon, but Nebraska plays Oregon this week, so who knows what's going to happen there. The Big 10 has more teams still in the race than anybody. Ohio State's probably going to get in. Michigan's probably going to get in. Got to assume multiple of Nebraska, Notre Dame, and Oregon get in. And then you still have Penn State and USC who aren't technically out of the race. So we could see realistically 5 teams from the Big Ten in the playoff, that's really impressive. In the Pac-12, we know the situation here. Washington State, and Arizona all fighting for spots in the conference championship against either Stanford or Cal. Those two teams play against each other this week. The winner clinches the South and will move on to the conference championship. In the SEC, this is a very, very interesting conference. So Kentucky's probably going to represent the East. Kentucky's probably going to get a playoff spot no matter what, although a win against Georgia would certainly cement that. Florida's probably going to get a playoff spot no matter what, but then nobody else is safe. There's a chance the SEC only has 2 playoff teams if everything fails, and Florida's not even technically a guarantee yet, although I think as long as Florida plays competitively against Florida State, they'll be fine. The Gators should be good. Kentucky should be good, but Georgia's on thin ice. And then look at the SEC West. Alabama and Oklahoma both struggled today. They play against each other this week. The loser's pretty much out of the race, and the winner still has to play against Kentucky in the SEC Championship. So there's a real shot that Kentucky and Florida are the only 2 teams in this conference who make the playoffs. As for the Group 5 conferences, Middle Tennessee State is in a position to control their own fate. If they win out, they're good. Navy's an interesting team because they could get an at-large bid, and then the West Division is pretty close as well in the American. For Conference USA, Tulsa looks like the best team here. They are currently 9-1 with their only loss coming to Syracuse. The Conference USA does not have the conference championship, so even if Tulsa wins out, I don't think they get in. Central Michigan's an interesting team. They'll probably play against Buffalo in the conference championship. The Chippewas are 9-1. Their only loss coming to Middle Tennessee State. They beat Southern Miss, which is proving to be a big win. So if Middle Tennessee State falls flat on their face, Central Michigan could get that Group 5 spot. It's not going to be anybody in the Mountain West, but if not Central Michigan, it could also be Southern Miss. The only problem is that Southern Miss lost to Central Michigan earlier in the season. So I think right now the order of the Group 5 teams for the committee would probably be Tennessee, Navy, Central Michigan, and then Southern Miss. Even though Southern Miss is ranked and Central Michigan isn't, I think you got to get the Chippewas the advantage with the head-to-head win, but Central Michigan would still have to win out. Let's take a look at the schedule for the final portion of the regular season, Week 13. A lot of big matchups. We talked about Arizona and Washington State in the Pac-12. Alabama, Oklahoma. Winner wins the SEC West. Losers done. Georgia, if they lose, they're done. Nebraska and Oregon, the winner probably wins the Big Ten West, so that's going to be a really big game. Week 14 is rivalry week. We've got some huge matchups here. Auburn, Alabama is going to be really big. Alabama's got to win out to get into the playoff, I think. Obviously, the big one here is definitely Florida and Florida State. Winner probably makes the college football playoff. Loser, who knows? Especially if Florida State loses, then who knows with them. And then in Week 15, much smaller slate. The only super important game amongst ranked teams, I would say, is Bedlam between Oklahoma and Oklahoma State. Also got the Army-Navy game as well, but Week 15 is a much smaller slate. So Weeks 13 and 14 are really what we're going to be watching out for in the next episode. I hope everybody enjoyed. I know we went through a lot today, a lot of chaos with all these conference races, but this is really fun. I'm enjoying the 12-team playoff because I feel like there are so many more teams in the race this late into the season. That'll wrap up the episode. Hope everyone enjoyed. Make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you are new. Peace out.